Hey everyone, and welcome to part 3 of Kerbal Space Program Expert Mode. You probably know the drill by now, but if you don't, I have 2 other videos you can watch. Last time, I began interplanetary travel, visiting Duna, Ike, and Dres. Today, I'll be venturing even further on more ambitious missions than ever before, where Jebediah and his brave crew of Kerbonauts will push the boundaries of science, and return home as heroes. Well, either that, or be stranded in the depths of space forever. But there's only one way to find out.
Ho ho ho.
Green Giant!
Out beyond Duna and Dres lies Jool, the largest planet in the Kerbalar system. While Jool itself has no surface to land on, unless your name is Stratzenblitz, its moon system offers some much more lucrative destinations. For the uninitiated, the Jool 5 is a classic KSP challenge to land on all 5 moons of Jool with a single mission. And that's exactly what I'm planning to attempt in this episode. However, it'll be no easy task, as each moon has its own unique challenges. So before I can even think about going to Jool, I'll need to make some more money. That starts with researching electronics, unlocking the seismic accelerometer experiment. This will be used on the Lunar Survey Lander 2, an uncrewed probe which will land on Minmus to complete survey contracts. The science it can transmit back to Kerbin is a nice bonus as well. Next, I get some contracts to recover stranded Kerbals from orbit. Developing on the reusable rockets I built last time, I'd like to design a single stage to orbit spaceplane, or SSTO, for future rescue missions. Researching aerodynamics and supersonic flight with some of the science I got from Dres, I can unlock the Panther jet engine. Then, using 2 Panthers for atmospheric flight and a Cheetah vacuum engine, I can build the Sparrow, which should be able to reach low Kerbin orbit and return to the runway for only the cost of fuel. I've decided that Jeb has had enough vacation time since landing on Duna, so I'll have him act as the test pilot. I haven't touched on jet engines so far in this playthrough, and they work a little bit differently compared to rockets. Instead of liquid oxidizer, jets take in oxygen from the atmosphere to work, allowing them to operate at a much higher efficiency. Unlike before, where I performed a gravity turn to escape the lower atmosphere as soon as possible, here I'll want to fly low to get up to as high of a speed as I can on jet power. In addition to requiring oxygen from the atmosphere, jet engines also have certain speed ranges in which they're most effective. The 2 lower tier jet engines, the Juno and the Weasley, have trouble getting above Mach 1, so they're not very useful for SSTOs. But with 2 Panthers in afterburning mode, the Sparrow can reach well over 800 meters per second. After crossing 20 kilometers in altitude, the thrust from the jet starts to drop off, so I'll fire up the vacuum engine to carry Jeb the rest of the way to orbit. Circularizing with 200 meters per second of Delta V remaining, I managed to get an encounter with one of the stranded Kerbals. There's no way to see what type of Kerbal it is ahead of time, so it's kind of like a fun blind box. This time I got a scientist, and MacLeod can EVA over to the Sparrow. The cockpit is the only part with the hatch here, so it's a bit of a game of musical chairs to get her inside, but I manage. After that, I'll set up a rendezvous with our second castaway, another scientist named Milbo. While getting him on board, the craft does start to spin out of control without a pilot, but Jeb saves the day. Now it's time for the hard part, getting back to the KSC. Without a heat shield, spaceplane reentries are always a bit dicey, and what I failed to realize ahead of time is that the Mark 1 cockpit I'm using has a pretty terrible heat tolerance. Using the last of the rocket fuel to deorbit, I'll pitch up as far as possible to bleed off speed in the upper atmosphere. The cockpit comes very close to melting, but miraculously, Jebediah survives. That's not the end of it though. Hurtling towards the KSC at several times the speed of sound, any maneuver will cause G-forces to spike. The other 2 have already blacked out, and Jeb is not far behind. Pressing caps lock to toggle fine controls, I can deploy the landing gear, and begin to line up the Sparrow with the runway. Finally, I'll crank the brakes to 200% power, and... we made it. After resuscitating Milbo and MacLeod, they can be added to my roster of Kerbonauts. I'm not too thrilled about nearly killing my best pilot, so, for the next mission, I decide to iterate on the Sparrow by replacing the cockpit with an inline version, and adding a fairing to the nose. Not only does this help with re-entry heating, but I can also stash a battery and antenna inside for utility. With Valentina at the helm, the Sparrow too can recover pilot Fredfree and scientist Tanstead, returning to the KSC without issue. Now, I think it's time to send my new recruits on a training mission. I'll build the Calico 6 using my new science experiments, and launch Murdrin, Gleald, and Gleemore on a mission to the moon. In addition to the accelerometer, I also unlocked the magnetometer experiment, which I can run in space on the way. After getting magnetic field reading from Kerbin and the moon, and going on a short side quest to get crew report from orbit for a contract, the lander touches down near the South Pole. After planting a flag, the crew gets to work assembling a new science base, deploying the Grand Slam passive seismometer. Unlike the other experiments from the Breaking Ground DLC, this one won't transmit science back to Kerbin over time. Instead, I'll need to create some seismic waves myself. On the way back to orbit, I'll decouple the extra crew cabin and let it fall back to the moon. As it crashes into the surface, the seismometer produces about 0.6 science points. So, it looks like I'll need to make a bigger impact. On the next Calico 6 mission, the spent transfer stage hitting the moon generates another 3.7 science, while Fredfree, Milbo, and Tanstead land in the Highland craters. Before returning to Kerbin, they can hop to the nearby polar lowlands for additional science. However, my quest to put new craters on the moon doesn't stop there. Bolting the bare minimum of a probe core, battery, and antenna to an upper stage, I can launch the Lunar Impactor Probe 1. I won't even bother to capture into moon orbit. Instead, I'll just aim for the South Pole, gun the thrusters, and... that's more like it. Meanwhile, I'll launch another mission to pay a visit to Minmus. There, the crew can set up another seismometer, and hop from biome to biome to get some extra science from the accelerometer. They'll just need to make sure to steer clear of the MIP too. It's around this time that I upgraded the Calico 6, using some of the reusable rocket technology from the Dres mission. Then, the newly built Calico 7 launches to the moon's far side basin. All this time, the MORP and MSL probes have been doing their thing, and making me a whole lot of money. I haven't talked about them much, but these missions have probably paid for like half of my entire space program at this point. If you happen to have the misfortune of playing this challenge for yourself, I'd highly recommend using survey probes like this. However, after so much hopping around, the MSL-2 is running low on fuel. So it's time to launch the MSL-3, which features an extra fuel tank, hopefully allowing it to last a bit longer. Likewise, the MSL-4 lands on the moon to replace the MSL-1. Now, having accrued more than 500,000 funds, I think I might finally be ready for the Jool 5. Using the science I've gathered, I can research advanced fuel systems, and, more importantly, nuclear propulsion. Based on a real engine designed by NASA, the NERV atomic rocket motor forgoes chemical combustion, instead injecting liquid fuel directly into a running nuclear reactor. I've mentioned it before, but in this game, the efficiency of an engine is determined by its specific impulse, or ISP. To put it simply, ISP measures how long the engine can burn on a given amount of fuel. The Poodle, the best vacuum engine I've unlocked so far, has an ISP of around 350 seconds. Meanwhile, the NERV has an ISP of 800 seconds, making it by far the best choice for interplanetary missions. But this improvement doesn't come cheap. Because I somehow forgot to mention it so far, I have R&D entry purchases enabled. So, in addition to costing 300 science to research the tech node, I'll also need to cough up 45,000 funds to unlock the part. Also, around now, KSP veterans might be expecting me to research the mobile processing lab. When crewed by scientists, this part can process data from collected experiments over time to multiply their science output. This is extremely overpowered for long interplanetary missions, which is exactly why I'm banning it for the rest of the playthrough. Also, while we're at it, I'm going to go ahead and ban ISRU as well, so I won't be able to refuel on other planets. With these constraints in mind, the level 2 launch pad isn't going to cut it for the Jool 5. So I'll have to spend another 288,000 big ones to upgrade it to level 3. Now capable of supporting vessels of unlimited size and weight, I'll be able to launch some much larger rockets. So, let's launch some larger rockets. Based on my reusable first stage design from earlier, the affectionately named Big Ass Booster is just capable of reaching orbit in a single stage, even with 50 tons of payload. The payload in question, 2 landers for the Jool mission. With the help of an extra tank for refueling, these should be more than enough to land on all 5 moons, and maybe even get in some biome hopping while they're there. I'll spare the gritty details, though, until we get closer to their destinations. Even with the max level launch pad, I still need to split the Jool 5 into 2 launches. The reason being, I don't quite have enough money to send up everything all at once. However, by deorbiting and recovering the booster, I can make back enough cash to afford another launch. Putting together a 2.5 meter command pod and lander can, I can make the Tiger, a 5-seat capsule to carry the crew to Jool, and if all goes well, return to Kerbal. To get it there, I'll cluster together a bunch of liquid fuel tanks, and add 3 nerves on a 2.5 meter engine plate. The nerves don't need oxidizer, so I'm using jet fuel tanks for this. With another big ass to launch the thing to orbit, the 4 veterans are ready to face their biggest mission yet. Also, Barry can come too, I guess. The Tiger, with its nuclear transfer stage, is considerably heavier than the landers, so the booster can't quite make it to orbit on its own. After circularizing with the nerves, I can still try to recover the booster, but I realize it's not quite rated for hard landings. Regardless, as the 5 Kerbonauts dock with the landers in LKO, the Tiger is ready to depart for Jool. However, while the nuclear engines have great fuel economy, their thrust leaves a lot to be desired. With such a low TWR, it's beneficial to split big maneuvers like this into multiple burns at periapsis, because the Oberth effect causes burns to be more efficient the faster a craft is moving. The first burn will raise my apoapsis out of low Kerbal orbit, then on the next pass, I can escape onto a Jool transfer. As the crew departs Kerbal, the Jool 5 is officially underway. And getting this far has nearly bankrupted my space program, so this had better be successful. Owing to its huge gravity well, Jool is not particularly difficult to get an encounter with. After a little less than 3 years in space, the Tiger enters the Joolian system, and Barry can get to work collecting the first science from high space. If I plan on staying for long though, I'll need to get into an orbit. While aerobraking like I did at Duna is possible here, I don't think the ship would survive hitting Jool's atmosphere at over 7 kilometers per second. Luckily, there's a better option available. With a short correction burn, I can set up a TYLO gravity assist that will capture me into a Jool orbit for free. Now, at this point, you may be wondering, how can I slow down without using fuel? Isn't momentum supposed to be conserved and all that? But to answer that, we need to talk about reference frames. When KSB calculates the velocity of a craft, that velocity is always relative to the planet that it's orbiting. Here, just before entering TYLO's sphere of influence, the Tiger is moving at about 3,200 meters per second, relative to Jool. But then, as it crosses into TYLO's reference frame, we need to subtract the velocity of TYLO itself, and the new speed is only around 2,200 meters per second, relative to TYLO. Gravity will accelerate the craft as it falls towards the moon, but decelerate it as it flies away. And eventually, just before leaving TYLO, it's moving at 2,200 meters per second again, exactly the same speed as when it entered. However, as the Tiger crosses back into Jool's reference frame, something strange happens. It's only traveling at 2,600 meters per second, almost 600 meters per second slower than it was originally. Even though the speed relative to TYLO remained the same, its gravitational pull changed my direction. So when TYLO's velocity was added back to the Tiger, the speed relative to Jool was much slower. But that still doesn't explain where the change in speed actually came from. You see, while TYLO's gravity was accelerating the craft's gravity also pulled on TYLO, increasing its momentum and kinetic energy by just as much as I lost. Or at least, that's what would happen in real life. The actual amount TYLO would move is so small that KSP doesn't bother to simulate it. But with successive gravity assists from TYLO and Lathe, I can lower my orbit further, and get some science from space low over Jool. Then, with the help of some aerobraking, I can capture into an elliptical orbit of Lathe, my first destination. Lathe, the innermost moon of Jool, is unique in being the only moon in stock KSP to have an atmosphere. On top of that, it's also the only body other than Kerbal to have oxygen, meaning that jet engines work here. With this in mind, I can transfer Jeb, Bill, and Bob into the Seagull, a Lathe lander based on the Sparrow spaceplanes from earlier. Lowering its periapsis into the atmosphere, they can begin their final descent. In order to fit the lander inside its fairing during launch, I decided to put the wings under the main fuselage rather than on the sides. This causes some slight stability issues on entry, but by firing up the jets as the atmosphere becomes thick enough, Jeb gets the spaceplane under control and glides the rest of the way to landing. Well, landing is somewhat difficult when most of Lathe's surface is covered by oceans. Regardless, the Seagull splashes down in the Sagan Sea. While the spaceplane survived its landing intact, you might notice that it's slightly inverted. Thankfully, this is nothing that a simple backflip can't fix. Now thoroughly right side up, the Kerbals can go for a swim while they collect the first science from Lathe. However, I can't plant a flag in the middle of the ocean, so the next order of business is to find the nearest dry land. To take off, I'll perform what I'm calling the dolphin maneuver, where I'll use the afterburners to dive under the water first before launching into the air. And yes, of course Kerbal jet engines work underwater, why wouldn't they? After a short flight, the Seagull lands in the shores biome. There, the crew can take off their helmets to get some fresh air and raise the flag. The Lathe excursion is far from over. With plenty of jet fuel left in the tanks, I plan to visit a few more biomes while I'm here. But first, in the distance I see an interesting looking rock, so I'll taxi over and collect it to bring back to Kerbal. In KSP, the same biome can have different science reports for being splashed down versus being landed. So, before taking off, I'll roll down to the beach to get some additional science. Then it's off to the large island chain to the west. While flying over the sands, I spot something else that looks interesting, so I land the seagull to check it out. It seems to be some kind of geyser. Better send Jeb to investigate. Well, that was fun, but we have a job to do, so I'll roll over to the nearby dunes biome and run the experiments once again. The next landing site I want to visit is this island to the northwest, featuring the aptly named Crescent Bay. Along the southern rim, the seagull touches down in the peaks biome. The mountainous terrain doesn't exactly make for a great runway, but with Jeb's piloting skills and a few quick loads, I managed to stick the landing. At this altitude, the air is too thin and cold to breathe, so the crew will have to keep their helmets on. After that, it's off to the bay itself, where I make another water landing, this time without flipping over. There are a few more biomes on Lay that I could explore, but I want to make sure I have enough fuel to return to orbit. So I decide it's time to head back to the mothership. After flying back to the equator and enjoying the views of Jool along the way, I'll fire up the afterburners to begin the ascent to orbit. While jet engines do work on Lathe, the atmosphere is a bit thinner than Kerbal, so their efficiency is reduced. However, the moon is also considerably smaller, so overall, reaching orbit is similar in difficulty, if not easier than on Kerbal. Unlike the Sparrow SSPOs, I didn't build the Seagull with reusability in mind. After the jets and wings have served their purpose, I'll decouple them and let the Terrier engine carry the crew the rest of the way to space. There, I can set up a rendezvous with the mothership, which is still sitting in elliptical orbit. Docking with the Tiger, I can transfer over all the science, then leave the Seagull behind to save mass. Because my apoapsis is already right at the edge of Lathe's SOI, I'll time warp until my orbit is aligned to escape Lathe in the prograde direction. Then, with just a 3 meter per second burn, the Tiger is on its way to its second destination. After that relaxing beach vacation, it's time for the crew of the Tiger to work for a living, because we're headed to TYLO. Not only is it the largest moon of Jool, it's the largest moon in the entire game. While its enormous mass is a godsend for gravity assists, as we've covered earlier, that's only a small mercy when you're actually planning to land on the thing. Because, despite being nearly the size of Kerbal, TYLO has absolutely no atmosphere to speak of, so aerobraking and parachutes are not an option. For this reason, TYLO has earned a bit of a reputation as one of the most difficult destinations in the Kerbal system. And before I can even land on it, it already starts throwing punches. Coming from Lathe, getting into a low orbit takes nearly 1,000 meters per second of delta V. It's here that I began to realize that I underestimated the fuel I'd need to get between the moons. So, to make the most of what delta V I have left, I'll consolidate the remaining liquid fuel into the central tanks. Then have Bill go on EVA to detach the extras. I'll also undock the spare tank, leaving it in an elliptical orbit to come back for later. Then, circularizing at a 20-kilometer altitude, Valentina and Barry prepare for the hardest landing of this mission. For the task, I've designed the Mule, a multi-stage lander with over 5,000 meters per second of delta V. But even then, it'll require precise flying to make it to the surface of TYLO and back. As the Mule begins to drop out of orbit, you'll notice that I'm not pointing exactly retrograde. Instead, I'm angling up slightly to keep my descent speed low, as with such high gravity, it's hard to recover if your craft starts falling too fast. 4 fuel lines ensure that the outer set of drop tanks drain first, and as they empty, I can decouple them and watch them fall away. In the final phase of the descent, we get to learn exactly why this maneuver is typically called a suicide burn. If I start my engines too late, Valentina and Barry will share the fate of the drop tanks, ending up as craters on TYLO's surface. But if I start too early, I'll come to a stop while I'm still kilometers above the surface, wasting precious fuel as I'll have to burn off the speed I gain from falling the extra distance. As you can see, that's kind of what I ended up doing here. This isn't a huge deal on low-gravity bodies like the Moon and Minmus, but with TYLO's gravity, this can easily equate to hundreds of meters per second of wasted Delta V. I suppose it's better than the alternative, but hopefully I have enough extra fuel to recover. Finally, with the 3 Terrier engines, the mule touches down in the Midlands, and the crew can take the first steps on TYLO's surface. The gravity here is too high to use EVA jetpacks, so it's a good thing I remembered to add a ladder. Climbing down to the surface, Valentina plants a flag, while Barry gets a chance to do some science. On the way here, I got a contract to collect the light TYLO stone, so I take some time to locate one nearby. Then, Barry can take a hike to go get it. Hopefully the word light is referring to its weight, as she'll have to carry it all 900 meters back to the lander. Thankfully, returning to orbit isn't quite as hard as landing on TYLO. It's still pretty hard though, as gravity fights you every step of the way. There's some extra fuel in the 2 outer tanks to help boost the mule off the surface, but after that drains, I have just 1 Terrier to push the crew back to orbit. While I can be much more aggressive with my gravity turn here than on Kerbal, I'll still have to pitch up enough to keep the mule headed upwards, and not careening back into the ground. Eventually, I managed to circularize at 19 kilometers with just 200 meters per second to spare. Then, I can rendezvous with the Tiger and dock the craft together. After detaching more of the empty fuel tanks from the nuclear stage, I can rendezvous with the tank in elliptical orbit, and use the mule's RCS to grab it and dock it to the mothership. While I'm doing that, I can also refill with the extra fuel, as the mule's final stage also serves as the lander for the remaining moons. Like I did before with Lathe, I'll time warp until my orbit aligns to give me a cheap transfer. Then, the crew of the Tiger departs TYLO, victorious, but not without a few scars. With just 500 meters per second remaining in the nuclear stage, the future of this mission is far from certain. However, there's not much I can do other than soldier on. While Vall is the second moon of Jool in order of distance, I'm visiting it third so I don't have to carry the extra stages I needed for the TYLO landing. Even without them, the mule has over 2,000 meters per second of Delta V, which should be more than enough to land on Vall and return to orbit. The Tiger's fuel reserves, on the other hand, are running dangerously low, so I decided to capture into an elliptical orbit and have the lander break the rest of the way down, circularizing at about 21 kilometers. Having walked on TYLO and lived to tell the tale, Valentina and Barry are unfazed by the icy moon below them. But while Vall is much smaller than its 2 neighbors, it's still easily larger than the moon, so landing on it is far from trivial. Vall's terrain is crossed by lots of mountain ranges, so as the mule descends towards the surface, I try to steer it towards one of the flatter areas in between. Overall, though, the landing goes smoothly, and the Kerbonauts touch down in the highlands. Stepping out onto the surface, Barry raises the flag just in time to watch Lathe eclipse the sun in the sky. Getting back to work, she can collect a crew report and surface sample from Vall, storing them in the lander for safekeeping. Then, using some advanced scanning techniques, I detect an ice chunk nearby, so Barry can go collect that as well. Having gotten all the science I can from this biome, the mule can begin to head back to space. While it has no problem reaching low orbit, the lander doesn't quite have enough fuel to rendezvous with the mothership, so the Tiger has to make up the difference. In a few orbits, the crafts dock together, and the 5 Kerbonauts are reunited. However, we have a bigger problem. At this point, I'll admit that it's been a while since I've had to do a Jool 5 without IRSU refueling, and I severely underestimated how much Delta V I would need to transfer between the moons. Even after draining all the extra liquid fuel into the nuclear stage and jettisoning the tank, I can't find a way to get to Bob or Paul that wouldn't take all of my Delta V just to capture into orbit. So, is this it? Are Jeb and the rest of the crew doomed to orbit Vall forever? Well, there is one more option.
Saving the Kerbin race one stranded explorer at a time.
Even though launching the Tiger took nearly all the funding I had, the milestones and contracts I was able to complete so far have made back enough to afford one more launch. To complete the mission and rescue their comrades, Gia, Gleemore, and Bobbert board the Tiger 2. Godspeed, gamers. To get the most efficient encounter at Vall, the Tiger 2 will repeat its predecessor's process of gravity assists, followed by aerobraking at Lathe. After capturing into Lathe orbit, a short burn puts the Tiger 2 on an intercept course with Vall, where I can begin to rendezvous with the Tiger 1. Running low on supplies after over 5 years in space, the crew of the Tiger 1 is no doubt overjoyed to see their salvation arrive. With a bit of docking port shuffling, I can drain the rest of the liquid fuel from the Tiger 1's nuclear stage and decouple it, having the Tiger 2 carry the command pod and lander out of Vall's sphere of influence. At this point, only 2 moons of Jool remain, and the inner of the 2, Bop, is where I'm headed next. Compared to the 3 inner moons, Bop lies on a very inclined and elliptical orbit. To get there, I'll set up another TYLO gravity assist that will put the Tiger 2 on course to encounter Bop right at its ascending node. The way I have the ship docked together right now is a bit unbalanced, so on the way to Bop, Bill can move around some docking ports, and I can reposition the Tiger 1 capsule to be more in line with the center of thrust. Bop itself is much smaller than the previous moons, being only slightly larger than Minmus. Its low gravity means it can take a lot of Delta V to capture, but as luck would have it, I found a much better Bop encounter this time, taking only 200 meters per second to circularize. It makes me wonder if I even needed to send the rescue mission in the first place. But anyways, because of the difference in inclination, my orbit ends up being nearly polar. This will be helpful, though, as I'm planning to land in the poles biome. In fact, I'm planning to land in all 5 of Bop's biomes. Undocking the mule, Jeb and Bob can begin their descent towards the North Pole. Bop's terrain is extremely rugged, having some of the highest mountains in the Kerbolar system. Even with the low gravity, it takes some effort to find a suitably flat landing site. But touching down in the poles, Bob can begin to collect the science, and Jeb can plant a flag. After that, I can repeat the process in the slopes, ridges, and peaks. Finally, I'll hop to the valley biome, where Bob discovers a large rubble pile. This feature, however, can't be picked up by a Kerbal, so I'll time warp to let Bob's rotation line up the lander with the Tiger's orbit, then launch back into space. After another rendezvous and docking, there's just one more moon to visit. The outermost moon of Jool, Pole, also lies on an inclined orbit, but not to the same degree as Bob. To transfer between the moons, I'll need to wait until Bob crosses Pole's orbital plane. Then plan a burn that will eject the ship from Bob and match inclination with Pole at the same time. Being in a polar orbit helps with this, as I can escape in the normal direction relative to Bob's orbit. It takes some more time warping to get an encounter, but in due time, the Tiger crosses into Pole's sphere of influence. Pole is the second smallest body in stock KSP, being only slightly larger than Eve's moon Gilly, but that's a topic for a future video. Like Bop before it, I intend to land on all of Pole's biomes as well for maximum science. With one more refueling from the tank on board the Tiger II, the mule deorbits for its final excursion. First on the docket is the lowlands biome. As I descend, you can begin to make out the large, spiky formations that cover most of Pole's surface. While I don't think these actually have collision, I'll still try to steer my landing to avoid them. After all, it's not like Delta V is in short supply here. Touching down on the surface, the crew can run the experiments and plant a flag in the same way we've seen so many times before. Then, they venture north to the Midlands, where Bob collects a yellow stone to take home. I'm sure it'll make a nice paperweight on his desk back at the KSC. After the lowlands and midlands, I'm sure you can guess what biome I'm headed to next. Pole is definitely one of the more colorful destinations, with the green of the highlands contrasting the darker yellows and oranges of the other locations. It seems similar to the colors of Io in real life, although those are caused by sulfur released from volcanic eruptions. Being so far from Jool, I find it hard to believe that Pole would be very geologically active, but maybe the data collected here could shed some light on that subject. Anyways, there's just one more biome to visit before I head back to Kerbin. With another suborbital hop, the mule lands in Pole's poles. Although, after touching down, it seems that the landing legs begin to sink into the ground. No big deal, Jeb can keep the lander upright while Bob goes on EVA. He plants the final flag of the mission, and it's gone? Ah, there it is, it's just floating 150 meters in the air. Okay, I think this might be my sign to leave. Orbital speeds on Pole are slow, so I can set up a rendezvous with the Tiger, even coming from a 90-degree inclination. After docking and transferring all the science from the mothership, I transfer as much liquid fuel as I can from the lander, while also draining oxidizer from the Tiger II's extra tank as I no longer need it. Then, the mule is left in Pole orbit while the Tiger begins its journey home. Instead of leaving for Kerbin right away, I'm going to start by lowering my Jool periapsis. Not only will this make use of the Oberth effect, but I'm also going to do another TYLO gravity assist to eject from Jool. It takes a fair bit of messing with maneuver nodes to find a good transfer back to Kerbal, but eventually, the crew are on their way home. Approaching Kerbal, I don't quite trust this thing to survive aero braking directly from a Jool transfer, so I'll use what fuel I have left to capture into an elliptical orbit. From there, I can re-enter the crew capsules one at a time. And once again, that brings us to the end of the episode. Man, that one took a while to make, but with the Jool 5 completed, only Moho, Eve, and Elu remain. So, barring some kind of catastrophic derailment of the entire playthrough, I think the next video will be the grand finale of KSP Expert Mode. As for when that'll come out, we'll just have to wait and see. If only there was some kind of button you could press that would notify you when I upload. Well, I guess I'll just have to see you next time. Bye.